The universe isn't digital, and we just proved it. The moment the patch lit up, the skin stopped screaming. A living circuit, actual bacteria, sensed the flare of inflammation and calmed it like a reflex. Meanwhile, across a Petri dish, tiny clumps of frog cells swept loose cells into a perfect ring, and it started to move. No code, no central brain. And here's the thing, if reality were just bits on a clock, none of this should work. UBC Okanagan says a digital universe can't hold. So if code can't explain life, what's running reality? 3 proofs, 1 model, and a way around the wall. Let's rewind 30 seconds. The problem: we can't compute. Get this? Every time we try to explain life as software, something slips through our fingers. We add more compute, bigger datasets, faster GPUs, and the system nods, until it meets the edge and stalls. That edge has a name now. At UBC Okanagan, Mir Faizal and colleagues used deep math, Gödel-style incompleteness, to argue a hard limit. A closed, step-by-step algorithm can't capture a complete, consistent account of reality. They call it a need for non-algorithmic understanding. In plain speech, there are true things in this universe that can't be reached by running an instruction list, no matter how big the machine. So why does that matter outside whiteboards? Because our whole digital-first worldview assumes that if something exists, we can simulate it. Turing machines, finite memory, discrete steps, right? We've built an empire on that metaphor. But here's the thing. Life keeps acting like it didn't get the memo. It works in gradients, fields, shape, and context. It doesn't wait for a clock tick to decide, it flows. Let's be clear about what the wall is not. It's not computers are slow. It's not we need quantum chips. It's a category miss. If the target phenomenon lives in non-algorithmic space, truths that are real but not derivable inside any fixed rulebook, no amount of scaling closes the gap. You can't brute force your way to the other side with more silicon. That's like turning up the volume to see farther. And we've tried. Whether models grind against chaos, protein folding needed a pattern learning sidestep. Brains. We've got spikes and weights but replicating agency. The way systems set goals and hold shape in changing conditions keeps dodging neat code. The wall shows up as plateau after plateau. Marginal gains, ballooning costs, mysterious failures when context shifts. We're optimizing a tool that's pointed at the wrong kind of problem. So what does a right kind of tool look like? Hold that. First, watch what broke my own map. At the University of Chicago in 2024, Tian's group did something that doesn't fit the gadget drawer. They built what they called active biointegrated living electronics. Not metaphorical living. Actual living bacteria, Staphylococcus epidermidis, woven into an ultra-soft patch. The patch doesn't just read signals. The bacteria sense inflammation and help resolve it. The device stores, survives, adapts. It's not a sensor nailed onto a body. It's a circuit that's part of the body's own logic. Why is that a problem for the digital frame? Because the computation here isn't stepwise symbol shuffling. It's metabolism, ion flows, membrane potentials, gene expression, continuous processes braided together. The patch is context-aware because it is the context. There's no line between data and device. And when it takes a hit, it heals. Try writing a for loop for that. Now swing to Tufts and the University of Vermont. Michael Levin and Josh Bongard took frog embryo cells, freed them from their tadpole destiny, and built tiny bodies, Xenobots, that swim. That alone is wild. But then came the curveball. Certain shapes, sea-like forms, moved through a dish of loose cells, herded them into a pile, and the pile matured into another mover. Kinematic self-replication. Not mitosis. Not budding. Motion and morphology doing the assembly in the environment. No new DNA program for this. It's the physics of bodies and the competencies of cells doing what they can under new constraints. If you write code for robots, you feel the ground shift here. There's no central controller, no explicit algorithm for replication. Change the shape, change the behavior. Morphology is instruction. Agency isn't upstairs, it's distributed across the tissue. And what nobody knew at the time they first cut those cells is how far that idea travels. If bodies compute by being the right shape in the right field, then a simulation that treats form as decoration misses the engine. But wait, there's a deeper layer people use to wave away. Quantum biology stopped being a punchline because plants refuse to behave. Evidence keeps piling up that photosynthetic complexes use quantum coherence to sample energy paths at warm temperatures, and enzymes push reactions with tunneling that defies classical shortcuts. In birds, magnetoreception hints at spin chemistry guiding navigation. Life seems to harness quantum effects without cryostats or clean rooms, knitting them into mesoscale bioelectric and mechanical patterns. Push these threads together and something snaps into focus. The UBC Non-Algorithmic Wall says, algorithmic closure won't capture reality. The UChicago patch says, living circuits compute by being alive, field first, analog self-repairing. The Xenobots say, shape is code. Bodies can discover new behaviors, even new reproduction modes without an explicit script. Quantum biology says, nature runs on context, superposition, and phase, rules that don't map cleanly to ticks and bits. So we need a model that starts with life, not as an outcome but as the organizing principle. A frame where sovereignty, systems setting their own boundary and goal, emerges from morphology, bioelectric fields, and quantum adaptive processes. Call it the Oklahoma Sovereign Inception Model, OSIM for short. Not mystical, not hand-wavy, just a sober claim. The base layer we care about, the one that makes matter do meaning, is biological, not digital. Before we dive, let's put the stake in the ground. If OSIM is true, it doesn't smash the wall, it walks around it. You stop trying to compress life into an algorithm and instead build with the same primitives life uses. Gradients, shapes, fields, growth. That's the loophole, and we can test it. The proof points are already here, humming in a lab patch, swimming in a dish, and flickering in the light inside a leaf. UChicago's Living Bioelectronics. So picture the bench at UChicago, spring 2024. Not a shiny smartwatch or a rigid PCB, an ultra-soft, skin-like patch that looks almost boring. Inside it, though, is the move that breaks the old frame. Living bacteria, Staphylococcus epidermidis, paired with gentle electronics, acting together as one circuit. Tian's team called it active biointegrated living electronics, and they meant it. The bacteria aren't passengers. They're the sensing, the actuation, the decision layer, woven right into the device. Here's what it does in plain terms. When the skin flares, the chemistry of inflammation kicks up. This patch doesn't just log the event. The microbes register the local cues like a neighborhood watch with real stakes and shift metabolism that calms the storm. The electronics don't bark orders, they shape the environment and read back what happens. Voltage, ions, metabolites all moving in a loop. The patch is both stethoscope and salve, brain and body in one sheet. And this is where the digital metaphor loses air. There's no central clock telling the system when to compute. It computes because life always computes continuously by flow. Ion channels open and close, membrane potentials drift, tiny voltage gradients ripple across cell layers like weather fronts. Those bioelectrical patterns aren't noise, they're maps. They steer growth, trigger healing, set identity. You don't have ones and zeros. You have graded fields that push cells to decide together what they're going to be. Get this, you can poke the system and it heals. If a wire on a chip breaks, it's done unless you swap the part. Here, the living circuit recruits, rebuilds, and keeps going. Damage is part of the conversation, not a fatal exception. That's because the materials are alive. They sense, adapt, and negotiate. They're not waiting for a programmer. They're doing their own I/O with the world that made them. Let's ground it in the lab. Tian's group didn't just sprinkle microbes for show. They designed an interface that lets the bacteria breathe, feed, and talk, while the electronics stay ultra-soft and skin-friendly. They tuned mechanical properties, water content, and charge so the whole thing sits on tissue like a second layer, not a scab. When inflammation spiked in tests, the community and the circuit shifted states together. The readout changed, the microenvironment changed, and the skin moved back toward baseline. That's closed-loop control without a server farm. Now tie that to bioelectric language. Developmental biologists have been mapping voltage patterns on tissues for years, retina to limb buds, finding that cells use tiny differences in potential to broadcast where and what now. Think of it like a field that encodes a higher-level goal. Make a finger here, close a wound there. The UChicago patch plugs into that layer, not by overwriting it, but by joining it. The control surface isn't an API, it's the body's own field geometry. Why does that beat silicon? Start with context. A silicon sensor samples, it doesn't belong. It needs calibration, sterile separations, rigid packaging. The moment the environment shifts beyond its training set, sweat, stretch, biofouling, it drifts. A living interface leans into the mess. New microbes slide in, the community adjusts, the skin stretches, the matrix flexes, and the bioelectric map rewrites. Noise becomes information. Time becomes part of the computation, not an error term. But wait, here's where it gets interesting. This isn't wetware cosplay. It's a different kind of logic. You don't send discrete commands, you nudge boundary conditions. You set voltages, shape geometry, feed gradients, and let the system find a path. It's analog in the best sense, continuous field-based multiscale. The bacteria metabolize, which changes local pH and ions, which changes voltage, which changes protein gating, which changes tissue state. That chain is the program. And because it's embodied, it's self-documenting. The state of the system is both record and plan. There's no gap between memory and actuator, no file system that can go stale while reality moves. The living circuit is its own ledger. If the light changes or the temperature drifts, the ledger updates with the same physics that will drive the next move. That's why it's robust. It can't not adapt. Let's talk stakes. If you can build circuits that live, you've just erased a line engineers have obeyed for a century. Devices here, organisms there. You've also dodged the brittle edge of the UBC wall. You're not forcing a step-by-step model to capture a fluid, non-algorithmic process. You're partnering with the process itself. The computation isn't simulated. It's happening in the only place it can, inside matter that's busy staying alive. From a design view, this flips the brief. You don't code behaviors, you grow them. You pick host species for specific competencies. S. epidermidis is a skin native. It understands that terrain. You scaffold a habitat that keeps those competencies online. You expose electrodes where the field will speak and listen. You plan for drift, because drift is the feature that finds the solution you didn't know to ask for. And here's the kicker for OSIM. If sovereignty, the system's ability to set and hold its goal, comes from the interplay of morphology, bioelectric fields, and metabolism, then this patch is a tiny sovereign. It senses harm, enacts care, and preserves boundary. It doesn't need an external oracle to tell it what health is. Health is the attractor encoded in the tissue field metabolism loop. That's inception from within, not instruction from above. We're still early. It's a prototype published in Science, sure, but not in every clinic. Yet the direction is clear. The more our devices become part of bodies, literally part, the more they tap into that non-algorithmic layer the wall points to. They stop imitating life and start sharing a boundary with it. And once you accept that, the next question writes itself. If living circuits can heal skin by being skin, what happens when living machines decide how to make more of themselves? Levin Lab's Xenobots, life that builds life. Hold on, because the next move doesn't just blur device and organism. It lets life build life with no genetic memo. At Tufts and the University of Vermont, a small team took cells from the animal pole of Xenopus levis embryos, the ones that would have become skin, and set them free from their tadpole script. No gene edits, no added neurons, just dissociated cells allowed to reaggregate, then sculpted into tiny bodies using microsurgery. They called them Xenobots. On their own, these little clusters started to move. Cilia on their surface beat like oars, and the body planned. The literal shape set how they swam. A plump sphere meandered. A crescent with a mouth-like notch scooped. None of this required a central control loop. The tissue was competent. The cells knew how to stick, push, and coordinate because staying alive bakes those skills in. Here's where it gets interesting. In a dish scattered with loose frog cells, certain Xenobot shapes didn't just bump around. They herded. The C-shaped bodies corralled the free cells into tight piles like a tiny bulldozer circling gravel. After a while, those piles compacted and without any new instructions matured into new movers. The parents didn't split. They assembled offspring externally. That's kinematic self-replication, and it had never been seen at this scale in living multicellular systems. Get this, you can change the behavior by changing the body. The team used an evolutionary algorithm to search morphologies in simulation, looking for shapes that would best gather cells. The C-shape popped because the notch stabilizes a vortex of cells like a little cradle. Build that shape in real tissue, and the lab saw the same effect. No one wrote replicate in DNA. Morphology wrote the instruction by shaping contact, flow, and probability. If you've ever coded a robot, you feel the gap. We design planners, controllers, and feedback loops to get a machine to pick up parts and assemble copies. Here, the copies appear because the body's physics and the cell's native competencies align. Agency isn't sitting somewhere in a CPU. It's smeared across the tissue, expressed through cilia, adhesion, and bioelectric crosstalk. The program runs because the parts are alive and the shape makes their work add up. Let's slow down on bioelectricity because it ties this back to sovereignty. Cells talk with voltage. Resting potentials and ion fluxes sketch a map that tells tissues what they are and what to do next. In a Xenobot, that same layer likely coordinates cilia beating and keeps the body coherent under stress. You don't need a brain to hold a goal. The field and the form can carry it. That's OSIM's heartbeat. Morphology as code, field as governor. People asked, is this really replication? It's fair. There's no genome-level template for make a Xenobot. But that's the point. Replication isn't a single trick of DNA. It's a family of processes that produce more of a pattern. Von Neumann sketched kinematic replicators in theory, machines that assemble copies from parts in the world. In biology, we hadn't seen multicellular tissues do it until this. Now we have a case where competence plus shape yields babies by motion. And this shocks AI and robotics for a simple reason. There's no explicit algorithm to port. If you try to digitize it fully, you start losing the edge cases. The way cells stick just enough, how flows gather, how timing emerges from contact. You can simulate pieces, sure, but the living execution draws on capacities that don't silo cleanly. Bioelectric memory, mechanosensing, stochastic search. The irreducible part is the embodied loop that keeps finding a way. But wait, there's a twist in the data. The replication isn't endless. It peters out after a few generations unless you keep the environment primed with parts and keep the morphology tuned. That's a feature, not a bug. It means growth stays under governance by context and form. Sovereignty here isn't unconstrained power. It's the ability to hold identity and produce more of it when conditions permit. That matches how organisms live, bounded by resources, steered by fields. So what did we learn? First, cells freed from their intended body plan don't become mush. They become agents in a new collective, ready to discover tasks their genome never saw. Second, bodies compute with their shape. The same genome in a different morphology yields different goals. Third, distributed intelligence is real. A swarm of cilia, guided by local signals, can write a global outcome: motion, herding, replication. Now tie this to the wall. If you assume reality is a digital tape, you try to capture Xenobots with a finite rule set and a central clock. You'll miss the self-organization as it happened because the system isn't executing steps, it's folding fields, flows, and contacts into a path. OSIM says build with those primitives. Want replication? Don't hardcode, shape. Want control? Nudge voltages and boundaries, then let the tissue negotiate the rest. Here's the kicker. This isn't a one-off stunt. The same lab uses bioelectric cues to grow extra limbs in planaria and to normalize frog faces after perturbation. Patterns remember. Bodies search form space. Xenobots are a clean, undeniable microcosm of that truth. Life can reassemble its own agency when you give it a new body and a playable field. And that means our next machines won't be coded, they'll be cultured. Quantum biology, the hidden layer. So zoom down past the cells we've been talking about, past cilia and membranes into the weird. For years, people said quantum effects can't survive in warm, wet biology. Too noisy, too messy. And then photosynthesis refused to play by those rules. In certain plants and bacteria, energy captured by pigments doesn't just wander downhill like a drunk. It takes the best path fast, with efficiency that made physicists squint. Here's the thing. When researchers hit those complexes with ultra-fast laser pulses, the signals looked wavy in time, like a beat, evidence of coherent quantum motion through multiple roots at once. Coherence in a leaf at roomish temperature, not a lab trick in a fridge. The protein scaffold seemed tuned to hold those quantum states just long enough to matter, then hand off the energy with almost no waste. Nature built a quantum router out of meat. Hold on, enzymes do a version of this too. Take reactions that should crawl if they relied on thermal bumps alone. They fly. The best fit is the substrate gets lucky. It's tunneling particles slipping through barriers they shouldn't cross classically. Proton tunneling in hydrogen transfer. Electron tunneling in redox chemistry. The protein flex and local fields line up the shot so the impossible path is the likely one. The rate changes track with quantum models better than with old school ones. And birds. The compass in some species looks like a chemical pair whose spins are linked, radical pairs, sensitive to Earth's magnetic field. Shift the field, the spin dynamics change, the reaction yield changes, the neuron fires different. That's a quantum sensor built into a beak or an eye. You don't need a magnetometer. You need entangled chemistry that decoheres on a schedule biology can read. Why does this matter for OSIM? Because it shreds the clean line between micro weirdness and macro order. The myth said quantum lives down there, sealed off. Biology says no. We'll pull that layer up into mesoscale patterns using structure, fields, and timing. Coherence doesn't need a vacuum if the scaffold filters the noise instead of fighting it. Tunneling isn't random if the protein breath sets the barrier. The control is baked into form. Now tie it to bioelectric networks. Cells sit in voltage landscapes. Ion channels respond to tiny shifts in field, and pH proteins are not dead lumps. They're flexing, polar, capable of changing shape with field cues. So you've got a stack. Quantum events nudged by protein structure, feeding into ionic flows, creating tissue-scale voltage maps that guide growth and healing. It's multi-scale and phase-like. Not binary, not clock, but rhythmic and continuous. Get this, the old digital metaphor wants clean, discrete states. But these systems work by superposition-like sampling, then collapse via structure into the next useful state. That's why life looks nimble. It's not guessing one path at a time. It's sculpted to hold options, then commit fast when context picks a winner. If you try to model that as bits flipping, you drown in state space. If you build with fields and morphology, you ride the tide. Here's a human moment. A plant biophysicist once told me the first time she saw the oscillations in her 2D spectra, she thought the instrument was lying. She reran it, same beat. She changed temperature, solvents, donors. The beat drifted like a living thing. She said it felt like eavesdropping on a conversation we weren't supposed to hear. That's the vibe across this field, structure singing to probability. But wait, this isn't licensed for quantum magic. Scope matters. Coherence times are short, and life leverages them through design, not wishful thinking. The claims that consciousness is a quantum computer leap a few steps we can't take yet. OSIM stays sober. Life uses quantum effects when it can stabilize them with morphology and fields. The payoff is speed, sensitivity, and options under uncertainty, exactly the traits we see in bodies that heal and adapt. So what nobody knew at the time we first framed everything as code is that the hidden engine under some of biology's best tricks isn't binary. It's wave-like, contingent, and context-bound. That engine hands a head start to systems that can sense their own boundary and nudge conditions, because tiny shifts at the right place change the whole flow. That's sovereignty at the smallest scale, control by shaping possibility. Now link back to our pillars. UChicago's living patch speaks voltage and chemistry. Xenobots show morphology writes behavior. Quantum biology explains how structure can hold fragile options just long enough to matter, then route energy and information cleanly. Stack them, and you get OSIM's core move. computation as embodied search across landscapes, not symbol juggling on an abstract tape. The wall says algorithms alone can't close the loop. Biology closes it by being the loop. Here's the kicker. If life rides coherence and tunneling through tuned structure, then designing living tech isn't about simulating every atom. It's about building scaffolds that make the best next state likely, then letting physics do the heavy lift. That's how we steer regeneration with voltage, grow devices that heal, and shape bodies that discover behaviors. You don't fake the quantum layer, you invite it. And when you do, systems stop following commands and start following form. OSIM, the Sovereign Inception Model. So here's the turn. We stop treating life as an afterthought and start from it. The Oklahoma Sovereign Inception Model, OSIM, is a plain claim. The layer that makes matter do meaning is biological, not as a metaphor, as a mechanism. Agency, identity, problem-solving, they're not apps running on a neutral substrate. They arise when morphology, bioelectric fields, and quantum adaptive chemistry lock into a loop. When that loop closes, a system becomes sovereign. It holds a boundary, sets a goal, and defends both against noise. Let me define it tighter. First pillar, morphology as code. The body's shape is not decoration. It constrains flows, stabilizes options, and writes behavior. We saw it with Xenobots. A C-shaped notch changes contact dynamics and births kinematic replication. Same genome, different body, new goal. That's instruction by geometry. Second pillar, bioelectric governance. Tissues hold graded voltage maps, resting potentials, and ionic currents that broadcast pattern-level intent. Change the map, the system changes fate. Tian's living patch works because it plugs into that field. It doesn't push commands. It tweaks boundary conditions so the tissue moves toward a health attractor. The map is both memory and plan. Third pillar, quantum adaptive engines. Proteins and scaffolds are tuned so coherence and tunneling do useful work at room temperature. That gives life a fast track through rugged landscapes, sampling before committing, sensing faint cues, flipping states with tiny nudges. It's not magic. It's design that holds the weird just long enough to matter. Stack those three and you get inception from within. A sovereign system isn't passively computed by an external algorithm. It computes itself by being a shaped, fielded, tuned body. That's why OSIM bypasses the UBC Non-Algorithmic Wall. The wall says, a closed, step-by-step algorithm can't give a complete, consistent account of reality. OSIM nods and shrugs, then builds with processes that aren't step-by-step in the first place. The computation is continuous, embodied, and context-bound. You don't cross the wall by adding more discrete steps. You walk around it by switching substrate. Map the evidence. UChicago's 2024 Living Bioelectronics proves you can make circuits that live, sensing, healing, and adapting because they're part of the body's field. That validates bioelectric governance as a design surface. The Levin and Xenobots show morphology writing behavior up to and including a new replication mode. No central algorithm, just shaped agency distributed across cells. That locks in morphology as code. Quantum biology, from coherence in photosynthesis to tunneling in enzymes and spin chemistry in sensing, confirms the engine that makes fast, sensitive, option-rich behavior feasible in warm, wet matter. That secures the quantum adaptive pillar. What nobody knew when we worship bits is how much work the body is quietly doing. In OSIM, software is not abstract code, it's embodied biologic. Change the shape, you restructure the program. Change the voltage landscape, you rewrite the subroutines of growth and repair. Tune the scaffold, you bias quantum choices toward useful outcomes. The compiler is metabolism. The runtime is a living field. So how does this look in practice? You don't boss systems around, you coax. You set initial and boundary conditions, geometry, voltage, chemistry, and let the system self-solve. You give it gradients to climb and rails to avoid cliffs. That's why Xenobots found replication without a recipe. The lab shaped a cradle, and cells with built-in competencies did the rest. That's why the UChicago patch resolves inflammation. The living circuit steers the local landscape back into a basin of attraction called health. OSIM also gives us testable predictions. It says you should find stable, rewritable bioelectric memories of form, voltage patterns that persist through cell turnover and guide regeneration. It says changing morphology alone with identical genomes will unlock qualitatively new behaviors because shape is an instruction channel. It says devices that join living fields, not just measure them, will outperform rigid sensors under perturbation because context is part of the computation. And it says fully digital simulations will keep failing to capture open-ended agency at scale because they're missing the continuous, fielded, quantum-tuned substrate. Here's the emotional core. Sovereignty is not spooky, it's a system's property. When enough competent parts are shaped and linked by a field that holds a goal, the whole pushes back. It refuses to be merely pushed around. That's why bodies heal. That's why Xenobots herd cells. That's why a living patch knows when to act and when to sit still. Sovereignty is the feeling of a basin of attraction with teeth. And there's a guardrail baked in. Because sovereignty in OSIM is embodied, it's bounded. Resources, geometry, fields, these limit what the system can want and do. Xenobot replication fizzles without parts and the right shape. Healing overshoots turn into scars if the field is wrong. That boundedness is good news. It keeps growth under governance, and it gives us levers to steer without brute force. So the model flips our default. The universe you care about isn't a clean tape, it's a garden of self-organizing loops. We stop asking, what's the code? And start asking, what shape, what field, what scaffold will let this system find the answer? OSIM doesn't claim to explain everything. It claims to explain the class of phenomena we keep failing to digitize: life, agency, meaning. And it hands us a build sheet grounded in 3 pillars we can touch right now. In a science paper from Chicago, a PNAS result with frog cells, and a decade of quantum biology that turned eye rolls into instruments. Confronting digital simulation theory. So let's face the big shiny idol, the digital simulation. The standard picture is clean, reality is bits, time is a global clock. Somewhere a master program runs discrete steps on perfect hardware. Everything we see is an output of that code. It's seductively neat. It also collapses when you press on how life actually behaves and when you look at the math. At UBC Okanagan, Mir Faizal and colleagues took a scalpel to the premise. Using Gödel-style incompleteness, they argued you can't get a complete, consistent account of reality from a closed, step-by-step algorithm. There are true statements, Gödelians, that won't fall out of any finite rulebook. They called the missing ingredient non-algorithmic understanding. Not woo, a boundary. If your universe is a program, it inherits that ceiling. It can't generate what it can't derive. Here's the thing. The digital sim story needs closure. It needs every event to be compressible into an instruction stream. But look at emergence in living systems. Xenobots changing replication by changing shape. The UChicago patch resolving inflammation by being part of the tissue's field. These aren't top-down instructions. They're bottom-up, field-driven behaviors that depend on continuous conditions and history. Try to squash that into a fixed-length tape and you start losing the plot. Compression is where this bites hard. In physics and CS, we lean on the idea that if a system is lawful, you can compress it. Write a short program that outputs its behavior. Works for orbits. Works for many lattices. Now try compressing regeneration after amputation, where bioelectric memory holds a missing limbs map and guides growth back to target morphology. The shortest program might be the body itself, its geometry, its fields, its quantum-tuned proteins. That's not a neat code you can upload. That's embodied information. And then there's latency. Digital sims run on clocks. Even with massive parallelism, you're still passing messages through a finite network with finite bandwidth. But bioelectric control in tissues behaves like a field. Changes propagate as coupled dynamics, often faster than you can serialize them without wrecking causality. You can emulate a field with a grid and time steps, of course, But the cost explodes as you chase real time, and the discretization errors matter right where life leans on subtle gradients. What nobody knew when they first pitched the simulation was how ugly the edge cases get. You can cheat by saying the simulator is infinitely fast, but that's not an explanation, it's a wish. You can say quantum computers fix it, but the UBC argument isn't about hardware speed. It's about what counts as derivable inside an algorithmic frame. If parts of reality require non-algorithmic understanding, then faster algorithms still miss those parts. Now line this up with OSIM. The mismatch is everywhere. Digital SIM assumes top-down code. OSIM sees morphology and fields writing behavior from the bottom up. SIM assumes discrete states. OSIM runs on continuous dynamics that don't snap to bit flips. SIM assumes a universal clock. OSIM lives on coupled rhythms that coordinate without a metronome. SIM assumes representation is separate from action. OSIM fuses memory with mechanism. The state is both ledger and lever. Irreducibility isn't an excuse, it's a design note. In living systems, the model that works is the body. You can build a digital surrogate for parts, ion channels, cilia flow, enzyme rates, but you'll keep running into corners where your neat representation lags the thing itself. Not because you're sloppy, but because the system uses its own structure to make choices in real time. That's what sovereignty feels like up close. So is digital SIM useless? No. It's a subset toy that shines on closed, compressible pockets of reality. It helps us predict orbits, design bridges, even guide Xenobot shapes in silico before we try them in tissue. But when we ask it to explain open-ended agency, context-sensitive growth, or field-mediated identity, it stalls. That's the UBC wall in practice. Diminishing returns as you push stepwise models against non-algorithmic ground. Here's the verdict I land on. The simulation frame isn't evil, it's just too small. Treat it like a microscope, great for certain scales, misleading for others. OSIM widens the lens. It says the engine that makes meaning isn't an external code base, it's the loop where morphology, bioelectric fields, and quantum adaptive chemistry cohere into a sovereign whole. That loop doesn't need to be simulated to be real. It needs to be built, joined, and steered. And get this, once you accept that, the anxiety falls away. We don't have to beat the wall with bigger GPUs. We root around it by growing systems that compute with their bodies. We use simulations as scaffolds, then hand off to living matter where the hard part lives. That's not giving up on rigor. That's choosing the right substrate for the job. Case files, 3 anomalies OSIM predicts. So if OSIM is real, it should light up places where digital-first thinking keeps tripping. 3 case files, each a small fracture in the code metaphor, each a clean fit for morphology, fields, and quantum adaptive loops. Case file 1, bioelectric memory and regeneration. Here's the everyday miracle. Some animals don't just heal, they rebuild to spec. Cut a planarian flatworm, it regrows the missing head or tail with the right orientation. You can even miswire its voltage map and get a 2-headed worm, then flip the map back and see normal patterning return on the next round. The memory isn't stored as a DNA edit. It's embedded in stable voltage gradients across tissues. Resting potentials and gap junction networks hold a map of target morphology, a body plan the cells can read. When injury hits, the field doesn't panic, it reasserts the pattern. In OSIM terms, that's governance by a bioelectric state that acts like a goal and a tractor. In a digital frame, you'd ask, where's the file? And you'd miss it because the file is the field. Damage doesn't corrupt a disk. It perturbs a basin of attraction that pulls the system back. The stakes are human scale: limb loss, organ damage, degenerative disease. If the map lives in voltage, then changing voltage can restore structure. That's a design surface, not a miracle. And it's falsifiable. If you scramble gap junctions or clamp potentials, regeneration should lose its aim, not just its speed. Labs have seen exactly that. Case file 2, Morphospace search by bodies, not brute force code. This one looks like play. In Xenobot work, shapes were explored in silico, sure, but the real discovery happened in wet tissue. Cells freed from their old role-tried forms. Some flopped, some swam, some herded loose cells into progeny. The genome didn't change between a sphere and a C-shape. Behavior did, because shape changed flows, contacts, cilia synchrony, and bioelectric coherence. Bodies searched form space by existing in it, not by computing it from above. You can feel the but therefore. We think we need to enumerate all possibilities, therefore we build giant search trees. Bodies don't, they exploit physics. A notch becomes a vortex cradle. Surface curvature changes adhesion probability. Field geometry stabilizes beating patterns. This search operates in parallel in matter with feedback at every scale. It's not magic, it's substrate competence. OSIM predicts that when you let competent parts explore under constraints, you'll find useful forms you didn't specify and couldn't easily compress. That's exactly what showed up. Try to port it as an explicit algorithm and you drown in parameters. Keep it embodied and you ride a short path to outcomes. Case File 3, Context-Dependent Identity. Cells switch roles by voltage and environment. Here, S the unsettling bit. Identity feels fixed. A skin cell is a skin cell, right? But flip the local electrical state or change the microenvironment and cells pick new fates. In development and regeneration, shifts in resting potential turn on cascades that move tissues from one attractor to another. Bone to cartilage, progenitor to neuron, even oncogenic paths reversed by restoring field coherence. That's a real lever. Voltage precedes and instructs gene expression, not just follows it. Under OSIM, this is the point. Identity emerges from a loop, not from a lookup table. Change the loop, morphology, field, chemistry, and the system renegotiates who it is. Digital expectations want a label stuck to a line. Biology keeps rewriting the line based on where the field says the goal lives. That's not uncontrolled drift. It's governed plasticity. It gives you a way to steer healing without micromanaging every gene. Set boundary conditions, watch the basin pull. Falsifier. If identity were only genetic code, field interventions wouldn't flip fate decisions with this reliability. Yet labs keep showing they do. Now why these three? Together they outline a circuit OSIM claims is primary. Memory of form and voltage, so there's a plan. Morphospace search in bodies, so there's exploration. Identity plasticity by field, so there's commitment and recommitment. That's the whole cycle of agency. Remember, explore, decide. And it runs on continuous dynamics. No central clock, no discrete instruction list. Here's where it gets interesting for engineering. Each case points to a control surface. For memory, write patterns with gentle voltage modulation. Onic drugs, microelectrode meshes, living patches that join the field like Tian's. For search, sculpt shapes that bias flows, soft lithography, biofabrication, even AI-guided morphologies you validate in tissue. For identity, tune local environments, pH, stiffness, bioelectric tone, so cells fall into the fates you need. Coax, don't command. And the wall. These anomalies aren't bugs, they're the places the algorithmic view leaks. They're also our handles. Build with them and you're not simulating life, you're collaborating with it. Engineering with OSIM. Design rules for living tech. So let's build with this, not just talk about it. If OSIM is right, design stops looking like coding and starts looking like cultivation. You don't write explicit steps. You set the stage so living matter solves the problem. 5 rules, straight from the pillars we've seen work in the lab. Rule 1, treat morphology as program. Shape is instruction. In the Xenobot studies, that C-shaped notch wasn't an aesthetic choice. It created a cradle that gathered cells and kicked off kinematic replication. Same genome, different geometry, new behavior. So in practice, you sketch behaviors with curvature, porosity, and surface texture. You design channels that bias flow, ridges that synchronize cilia, cavities that hold cargo. Use AI to suggest candidate forms, sure, but validate in tissue because the real compiler is the body. Expect surprises. The good ones come when form unlocks competencies you didn't foresee. Rule 2. Use bioelectric fields as control surfaces. Voltage writes pattern. The UChicago living patch works because it joins the tissue's field and nudges it back into a health basin. That's your interface. Instead of blasting commands, you modulate local resting potentials with ionic cues or microelectrodes embedded in soft matrices. You map the native field first, who's hyperpolarized, who's not. Then you paint gentle gradients that shift fate decisions. This is closed loop, but not with a cloud server. The loop closes in the matter itself. Build meshes that are ultra-soft and permeable so cells can breathe, feed, and talk while you listen. Rule 3, coax, don't command. Set constraints, let systems self-solve. That means specifying initial and boundary conditions, geometry, stiffness, pH, voltage, tone, then stepping back. You stop pretending you can micromanage millions of degrees of freedom. You provide nutrients and rails, then watch for the basin of attraction you want. If it's wound closure, you bias epithelial migration and keep inflammation in a narrow band. If it's tissue assembly, you tune adhesion and flow so aggregates find each other. You're gardening, not puppeteering. Rule 4, build hybrid devices, living where it counts, synthetic where it helps. Let microbes, tissues, and organoids handle sensing, integration, and repair. Let soft electronics provide readouts, energy routing, and safety interlocks. The Tian lab showed the pattern: an ultra-soft carrier, native bacteria as active elements, and gentle sensors that don't fight the body. Extend that. Grow living filters that self-unfoul. Cultivate conductive gels that heal microcracks. Embed enzyme networks that tunnel electrons for ultrasensitive detection. The goal isn't to replace life, it's to partner with it. Rule 5. Sovereignty and safety are not afterthoughts, they're core architecture. Sovereign systems set goals and hold boundaries, which is exactly what you want for robustness, but it can also run away if incentives are wrong. So you build guardrails into morphology and metabolism. You cap replication with resource gates and shape-dependent kill switches. You favor local-only competencies, like herding cells within a defined niche, over open-ended exploration. You log bioelectric states as audit trails because the state is both memory and plan. And you align objectives with tissue health. If the field coheres, the device thrives. If it fragments, it winds down. Let's ground this in a workflow you can run now. Start with a target behavior, say, chronic wound closure. Step 1. Characterize the wound's voltage map and mechanical profile. Step 2. Design an ultrasoft scaffold whose geometry supports epithelial migration and whose embedded electrodes can raise local hyperpolarization to pro-healing levels. Step 3. Seed with a native microbial consortium. S. epidermides is a candidate that senses inflammation and secretes calming metabolites. Step 4. Test in vitro with perturbations, stretch, sweat, biofilm challenges, and watch for self-healing of both scaffold and function. Step 5. Iterate morphology, not just parameters. Add microchannels to redirect exudate. Add notches that stabilize islands of regenerating tissue. You're shaping flows and fields so the living parts can do what they're built to do. Now push to a different domain, environmental sensing. Build a floating bioelectronic lily pad for rivers. The pad's leaf is a living hydrogel seeded with electrogenic microbes tuned to specific pollutants. Its veins are soft conductors that read potential changes as the microbes metabolize targets. Its underside hosts microvortices sculpted into the gel that concentrate particulates, morphology as preprocessor. The quantum wind shows up in enzyme networks that tunnel electrons, giving you sensitivity down to trace levels at ambient temperature. You don't ship it with a fixed code base. You ship it with boundary conditions and let the local community adapt within a sovereign envelope. How do you know this beats silicon under stress? You run head-to-head trials, perturbation batteries, temperature swings, fouling agents, mechanical fatigue, unknown interference. The prediction from OSIM is clear. Devices that join living fields will degrade gracefully and self-correct, while rigid sensors drift or fail hard. You measure time to failure, error growth, and recovery without external recalibration. If the living hybrid doesn't outperform under these hits, your design isn't tapping the field layer yet. Back to geometry and voltage. And here's the craft note. Document through states, not snapshots. Archive voltage maps, impedance spectra, and morphological metrics over time. These are your logs. They let you replay how sovereignty held under load. They also become your design library, because patterns that worked in one tissue often rhyme in another. Finally, culture the team, not just the tissue. You need biologists who speak circuits, engineers who respect microbes, and ethicists in the room from day one. Because when you build sovereign tech, you're not just deploying tools, you're negotiating with partners. Treat them that way and you'll get machines that heal, adapt, and within bounds you set together decide. Objection, hard questions, and falsifiers. All right, let's stress this thing until something snaps. The first jab is always, isn't this just complex algorithms? You know what? If by algorithm you mean a process with steps, then sure, biology has processes. But here's the thing. OSIM isn't claiming life is unstructured chaos. It's saying the structure is continuous, embodied, and field-driven, not a discrete, clocked list you can fully serialize. Enzymatic tunneling, tissue voltage maps, morphology shaping flow. These are computations expressed through matter, not through symbols shuffled by an external interpreter. The key difference is where the control lives. In OSIM, control is distributed across geometry, fields, and quantum adaptive chemistry that run in parallel and don't need a master pointer. Second jab, where's the math? Fair. We're not throwing away math, we're shifting which math. Field theory for bioelectric landscapes, dynamical systems for attractors and bifurcations, category theory for compositionality across scales. Those are formal tools that already exist. The University of Chicago patch plugs into a field you can measure in volts and ohms. The Xenobot morphology search used evolutionary optimization in silico, then validated in wetware, a pipeline you can model as a coupled dynamical system. And the UBC Okanagan result, from Mir Faizal and colleagues, puts a guardrail on algorithmic closure using Gödel-style incompleteness. That doesn't kill rigor. It forces us to pick the right formalism for a substrate that isn't stepwise. Third jab, quantum woo, hard stop. We're not sprinkling quantum like glitter. We stick to verified effects. Coherence in photosynthetic complexes observed with ultra-fast spectroscopy. Proton and electron tunneling matching kinetic isotope effects and temperature profiles in enzyme catalysis. Radical pair magnetoreception hypotheses with testable, field-sensitive reaction yields. The claim is narrow. Certain biological structures stabilize short-lived quantum phenomena long enough to matter, then hand off to ionic and mechanical layers. No magic minds, just engineered scaffolds exploiting physics. Now the hard part, falsifiers. If OSIM is more than vibes, it must make predictions that can fail. So here are 5 with teeth. Falsifier 1. Living bioelectronic hybrids outperform rigid sensors under perturbation. Build Tian-style ultrasoft patches with native microbes and field-coupled electrodes. Run stress tests, thermal swings, mechanical stretch, biofouling, and unknown interference. OSIM predicts graceful degradation and self-correction without external recalibration, because computation closes in the matter. If rigid controls match or beat them across perturbations, OSIM loses a pillar. Falsifier 2. Morphology alone unlocks new behavior with the same genome. In Xenobot-style systems, hold cell lineage constant. Vary only 3D shape and surface textures. OSIM predicts qualitative behavior shifts, herding efficiency, cargo handling, even replication onset, driven by geometry. If behavior tracks only with added code or external controllers, morphology as code weakens. Falsifier 3. Stable, rewritable bioelectric memories of target morphology. In regenerating systems or organoids, map resting potentials before and after targeted voltage writing. OSIM predicts pattern-level outcomes, corrected growth, orientation fixes, persist through cell turnover. If voltage interventions don't produce durable, specific anatomical changes, bioelectric governance shrinks to a side effect. Falsifier 4. Quantum adaptive advantage at ambient conditions. Engineer two enzyme networks, one with protein scaffolds tuned for tunneling pathways, one mutated to blunt those modes. OSIM predicts measurable sensitivity and speed gains in the tuned network, robust to noise. If both behave identically under ambient noise, the quantum pillar needs a rethink. Falsifier 5. Algorithmic closure fails for open-ended agency at scale. Set a benchmark. Context-shifting tasks with morphology changes mid-run, like Xenobot collect and assemble in variable media. Challenge top-tier digital sims, including learned controllers, to match wet systems, adaptability without environment updates. OSIM predicts brittleness and escalating complexity on the digital side, while embodied systems adapt with bounded design effort. If digital models generalize cleanly without exponential blow-up, the wall feels lower than we claim. But wait, what would disprove OSIM outright? 3 bullets. If living hybrids don't show perturbation resilience beyond smart error correction in silicon, the bioelectric governance advantage is hype. If shape tweaks in constant genome systems can't create qualitatively new competencies, morphology as code is overstated. And if controlled studies keep failing to show ambient quantum contributions after rigorous artifact checks, the engine we're leaning on sputters. Any two of those failing hard would force a retreat. And what strengthens OSIM? Replicable demonstrations that writing tissue voltage maps sets anatomy-level changes across species. Scalable libraries of morphology behavior pairings where geometry predicts competencies better than sequence alone. Direct measurements linking scaffold design to extended coherence times or enhanced tunneling yields in functioning bioelectronics. Plus, an applied win, a living device clinically outperforming state-of-the-art silicon across months of messy reality. Here's a fair objection. Aren't we moving the goalposts by saying non-algorithmic but still using simulations to help design shapes? No, we use digital tools as scouts, not sovereigns. They propose forms. The wet runtime decides. That division is the point. You don't have to compute the whole landscape to walk it with a good map and sturdy boots. Last one, ethics. Sovereign systems can push back. OSIM builds guardrails into morphology, resource gates, and field dependencies. Falsifier here is social. If governance fails in deployment, unbounded growth, ecosystem harm, we didn't design sovereignty, we abdicated it. The fix isn't a kill switch in the cloud, it's constraints in the body. So yes, bring the hard questions. The only answers that matter here are the ones a lab can measure, a clinic can trust, and a river can survive. Bypassing the UBC, non-algorithmic wall. So back to the wall. UBC Okanagan's point isn't computers are weak. It's closed, stepwise descriptions won't capture a complete, consistent reality. If you keep forcing life into that frame, you'll plateau. OSIM's move is simple. Change the substrate and the rules. Don't push more bits through a clock. Build with gradients, shapes, and fields so the computation closes inside living matter. Start by naming what we stopped doing. We stopped pretending we can write a full instruction list for healing, growth, or open-ended adaptation. We stop treating bodies as data sources and start treating them as co-computers. The bypass begins when model stops meaning a top-down program and starts meaning a scaffold that lets a system find its own path. 3 practical shifts do most of the work. First, learning by growth. In silicon, you backprop through weights. In living substrates, you guide tissue to change shape and connectivity, morphological learning. That means growth cones, matrix remodeling, and microarchitecture become your plasticity knobs. Instead of tuning a million parameters numerically, you tune geometry and let contact mechanics, adhesion, and field coupling settle into function. Xenobots discovering replication wasn't a fluke. It was growth plus shape exploring morphospace in matter. Second, control by constraints. Classical control pushes commands down a pipe. Bioelectric governance nudges boundary conditions. You set resting potentials, pH, stiffness, and nutrient rails so the attractor you want becomes the easiest basin to fall into. That's what Tian's patch does. It doesn't micromanage cells. It raises the odds that inflammation resolves by joining the field. The closed loop is local and continuous, not serialized through a server. Third, compute by structure. Proteins and scaffolds are preconditioners for physics. You don't calculate every path. You build a structure that favors the best path. In photosynthesis, coherence rides a tuned lattice. In enzymes, tunneling emerges because the pocket flex lines up donors and acceptors. In devices, you sculpt channels, cavities, and charge landscapes so options collapse where you need them. That's not hand-wavy. It's the reason room temperature sensing can hit ridiculous sensitivity without cryogenics. Here's how the bypass looks day to day. You face a task that digital twins choke on, say, guiding regeneration in a complex wound with shifting infection and pressure. The old plan: build a high-fidelity sim, collect terabytes, train a controller, hope it generalizes. The OSIM plan: map the wound's field and mechanics, then deploy an ultra-soft scaffold seeded with competent microbes and microelectrodes that tune local voltage tone. You set morphology to bias epithelial migration, lay down microvortex features that keep debris moving, and let the living loop do the integration. The computation of when to proliferate, when to calm inflammation, and how to close gaps runs in the tissue field metabolism cycle. You measure outcomes, rewrite geometry, not code. But wait, what about prediction? We don't throw it out, we flip where it lives. Prediction sits in the body as an attractor landscape. A healthy limb pattern is a deep basin. After injury, the field deforms but still points downhill to the goal. Your job is to fix the terrain, not compute every trajectory. You get reliability by deepening the right basin. Hyperpolarize here, soften there, add a notch to stabilize a migrating front. So many microhistories roll to the same macro outcome. Latency: the field beats the clock. Digital control polls states and dispatches commands. Tissue fields propagate changes as continuous dynamics. Gap junctions, ion flows, and mechanical couplings move coordination faster than you can serialize without exploding cost. That's the point. You're not trying to beat the wall's stepwise bottleneck. You're avoiding it by not stepping. Irreducibility stops being a curse and becomes a tool. If the shortest program for a behavior is the body itself, then build the body. The model that works at runtime is the morphology plus field. Your simulations become sketches and scouts. You run evolutionary searches for candidate shapes. You model field responses. Then you hand off to wet validation, because only the embodied loop knows the corner cases. What does success look like? A stack of devices that degrade gracefully under chaos, learn better with age, and heal themselves. A clinic where writing a voltage map is as normal as writing a prescription. A lab where changing a cavity's curvature unlocks a behavior you didn't specify. A river sensor that adapts to a new pollutant without a firmware push, because its enzyme network tunnels electrons along a path you primed structurally. And the proof you've bypassed the wall isn't poetry, it's performance. Head-to-head under perturbation, the living hybrids hold function while rigid sims and sensors drift. Under novelty, morphology changes carry competence forward without a central retrain. Under resource limits, the system prioritizes like a small sovereign. Protect boundary, preserve function, then explore. None of that requires an infinite algorithm. It requires a substrate that computes by being. So yeah, we stop trying to smash through a door that math tells us won't open. We grow around it. We cultivate geometry, voltage, and tuned chemistry until agency shows up and stays inside bounds we set together. That's the bypass, not a hack, a change of medium. Consciousness in a non-digital universe. Alright, so if computation closes in bodies, where does that leave consciousness? Let's keep it grounded. No mysticism, no hand-waving. Think sovereignty, the system's ability to set a boundary, hold a goal, and update itself in real time. Consciousness in this frame is what it feels like from the inside when that loop gets tight and rich enough. Not a ghost in the machine. A property of a living field loop that integrates signals, weighs options, and defends a self. Here's the thing, you don't need a codebook to get awareness, you need integration with stakes. A jellyfish coordinates a body without a brain. It isn't writing poetry, but it maintains a boundary, senses gradients, and acts to keep itself going. Crank up the capacity. More morphology, deeper bioelectric maps, tighter scaffolds that hold fragile options longer, and you get richer experience. That's a graded view. Consciousness isn't on-off. It's a slope built from structure, fields, and quantum adaptive sensitivity. So what carries the now? In OSIM, the present lives where bioelectric governance binds parts into a single, time-coherent whole. Resting potentials and fast ionic waves stitch brain and body into a coupled field. That field doesn't just represent the world. It's acting on it in us, steering motor units, hormones, and attention. Memory isn't a file. Remember the regeneration case. So neither is awareness. It's a moving pattern that stays itself by staying in a basin. Disrupt the basin, seizure, anesthesia, and the loop loses sovereignty. Subjectivity dims. But wait, do we need quantum effects in the brain to get mind? Careful. OSIM doesn't claim neurons are quantum computers. It claims biology leverages quantum adaptive tricks where they help speed, sensitivity, option sampling. And those feed the bioelectric field that binds the show. Photoreceptors push electron flows with tunneling. Enzymes clear metabolites at brain speed. Maybe certain proteins hold coherence just long enough to sharpen timing. The feel of a thought isn't a qubit. It's the coordinated phase of a living field that can flip fast because its parts sit on tuned scaffolds. Get this, morphology matters even for mind. Cortical folds, dendritic trees, axon spacing. Those shapes don't just pack more cells, they set delays, resonance, and coupling that create stable, flexible rhythms. Change the shape, development, injury, neuroplastic growth, and you change capacities. Same genome, new wiring, new self. That's morphology as code at the mental level. Agency rides the form. So what does this do to AI sentience claims? It trims the hype. A giant language model is impressive pattern completion, but it's not a sovereign loop. No boundary to defend. No bioelectric governance tied to metabolism. No quantum adaptive tissue coupling soaked in meaning because survival is on the line. It can pass tests by remixing symbols, but it doesn't own a body plan or a field that says, keep me intact. In OSIM terms, it lacks inception. It's not generating goals from within a living loop. Could we build artificial consciousness? Maybe, but we'd stop chasing disembodied code and start cultivating living substrates. You need morphology that sustains integration, fields that hold self-maps, and metabolic stakes that make updating matter. Hybrids could bridge it. Organoid networks seated on ultra-soft meshes that speak voltage, surrounded by support tissue so their signals aren't noise but governance. You'd measure sovereignty the honest way. Resilience under perturbation, goal preservation with scarce resources, self-repair that protects identity. Now ethics, because this bites. If consciousness is graded and emerges from sovereignty, we owe respect where those loops show up. Lab organoids that develop stable, integrated rhythms with feedback, those aren't spreadsheets, they're potential someones. Xenobot collectives that start holding shape against disturbance, same caution. Our design rules already include sovereignty and boundaries as architecture. They have to become moral guardrails too. We limit growth by morphology, cap resource access, and build field dependencies that keep systems local. Not to stunt them, but to keep our agreements tight. If a device learns to defend a boundary, we treat that boundary as real. Here's a clinical angle that lands fast. Depression, chronic pain, some epilepsies. These look like field governance problems. Attractors too deep, rhythms locked. Writing bioelectric maps non-invasively or with living meshes could loosen the trap, let the system remember a healthier self and climb out. That's not reprogramming in the code sense. It's changing the landscape the mind lives on. Patients don't need perfect models. They need basins they can fall into and trust. What nobody knew when we framed mind as software is how much the body is the mind's runtime. Gut signals, immune tone, fascia tension, even microbiome metabolites, all feed the field that binds awareness. In a non-digital universe, consciousness is not a floating algorithm. It's a garden you keep alive. Tuned scaffolds, clean flows, steady voltages, and slack for the weird layer to help when timing gets hard. So the ask is simple and hard. Stop arguing if a chatbot feels. Start building living systems that can hold a boundary kindly and listen for sovereignty in their states. When it shows up, we don't crown it or crush it. We negotiate. Because if OSIM is right, consciousness is what happens when matter figures out how to mean together. And that starts with how we treat the first small selves we grow. The flip science after OSIM. So flip the frame and watch the pieces line up. Biology isn't an application of physics. It becomes the place we read first principles. The lab bench turns into a courtroom for base reality. Morphology as code, bioelectric governance, quantum adaptive engines. That's your new triad. We stop asking particles-only questions and start asking, what shapes and fields make matter carry goals? Here's the research agenda that follows. First, morphogenesis control as a discipline, not a niche. We build atlases of target morphology, voltage maps and mechanical fields that correspond to stable forms, then learn how to write them. Not gene by gene, but with pattern paints, ionic cocktails, ultra-soft electrode meshes, and living patches that join local fields. We do it across species to see what's conserved and what's plastic. The deliverable isn't a catalog of parts. It's a library of attractors and how to deepen or shallow them. Second, quantum adaptive bioelectronics. We design scaffolds that extend coherence just long enough to matter at room temperature, and we measure it in situ. Think enzyme networks built into soft conductors where tunneling sharpens sensitivity, or pigment protein hybrids that root charge the way photosynthetic complexes do, but pointed at toxins, neurotransmitters, or pathogens. The bar is performance under noise. If it needs a cryostat, it's not OSIM grade. Third, living computation as an engineering field. Not metaphor, devices that compute because they are alive. We grow organoid controllers on ultra-soft meshes that speak voltage both ways. We let morphology learn, axon sprouting, dendritic pruning, under constraint tasks that reward boundary defense and energy thrift. Readouts aren't just spiked trains, they're field maps over time. We care less about benchmark scores, more about resilience. Recover from perturbation, preserve function under scarcity, heal after insult. Education has to change to make that real. We train kids to cultivate, not just code. Studios where teams co-design shape, field, and chemistry, then watch behavior flower. Courses on gap junction networks alongside circuits, attractor landscapes alongside algorithms. Wet benches with high school-safe bioelectric kits where you can paint voltage and see planaria regrow weird, then normal, because you rewrote the map. Industry flips from extractive to grown. Medicine moves from symptom control to pattern writing. Chronic wounds get living meshes that join the field and nudge tissue back to a healthy basin. Autoimmune flare. Tune voltage tone to damp runaway attractors without smothering the whole immune field. Organs on morphology become the standard preclinical test. If your intervention can't fix the pattern in a living field, your model was lying. Energy capture borrows from leaves. We grow films that stabilize excitonic transport without rare metals. Materials get cultured, not mined. Self-healing composites that recruit microbes to close cracks. Filters that unfoul by changing local field and flow. Textiles that tune breathability and conductivity by swelling and shrinking with humidity. The form doing the computing for comfort and power. AI stops acting like a god and starts acting like a scout. We use sims to propose shapes and boundary conditions, but we don't worship their outputs. Every suggestion hits wet validation early, with living systems telling us where the map is wrong. The loop gets tight. Simulate to sketch, culture to learn, measure to correct, then feedback. Models become apprentices to matter. Here, S where the discovery curve steepens. When you stop forcing life into stepwise code, you stop spending years on brittle hacks. You open room for emergent competence to help. Labs will stumble on functions they didn't specify. Tissues that learn to reject specific biofilms without antibiotics. Xenobot-like swarms that clear microplastics by shape alone. Organoid networks that stabilize erratic heart rhythms via field coupling. No pacemaker firmware needed. Failure shifts from "we wrote the wrong code" to "we shaped the wrong basin." That's fixable fast. Safety's baked in from the start. We treat sovereignty as both power and limit. Designs cap replication through morphology and resources. Field dependencies keep devices local, starve the tone, they wind down. Audit lives in voltage logs and growth records, not black boxes in clouds. We align incentives. If the host tissue thrives, the device thrives. If coherence fractures, the device loses capacity. That's not optimism, it's architecture. Policy needs to catch up, so we write it now. Certification for living devices measures perturbation resilience and boundary respect, not just single metric performance. Data governance extends to state governance. Bioelectric maps are personal, like genomes. We keep them private by default because they're not just signals, they're cells. Approvals require explicit morpho-safety plans, how replication ends, how fields are fenced, how growth stays in scope. And culture. We start telling different stories. Not man versus nature, but partnership. We show kids a flatworm regrowing the right head after a voltage paint and say, that's a program too, just written in fields. We let people hold ultra-soft meshes that feel like skin and watch them close a cut on a grape. We move off from gadgets to gardens. Now pull back to OSIM's core. If biology is the new physics, then first principles live where matter means. We don't abandon equations, we point them at the right layer. Fields, attractors, structure that holds options. We don't ditch chips, we seat them in living loops where they help without pretending to rule. And we don't fear the UBC wall, we accept it as a landmark and walk a wiser path around it. Because here's the quiet promise. When you build with sovereignty, shape, field, tuned chemistry, systems learn to care for themselves. That's the scale break science has been missing. It's not a trick. It's the ground we've been standing on, finally seen. Coda, what we just proved and why it matters. So let's land this clean. We put 3 anchors on the table and watch them line up. First, UChicago's 2024 Living Bioelectronics from Tian's lab. A soft patch that doesn't just read a wound, it joins the tissue's field with S. epidermides onboard, senses inflammation, and helps resolve it. That's a living circuit proving bioelectric governance is a real control surface, not a metaphor. Second, Levin and Bongard's Xenobots, frog skin collectives that change behavior when you change shape, and at a sweet spot, sweep loose cells into motile kids. That's morphology as code with kinematic self-replication as the shock reveal. Third, quantum biology's verified wins, coherence nudging energy transfer in photosynthesis, tunneling speeding enzyme chemistry, spin chemistry likely steering avian navigation. That's the ambient engine making warm, wet matter fast, sensitive, and option-rich. Here's the thing we prove to ourselves by stacking them. If you start from life-first principles, shape, field, tuned chemistry, you get agency that isn't a digital program running on inert parts. It's a loop closed in matter. And that loop walks around the UBC Non-Algorithmic Wall because it doesn't need an exhaustive, stepwise description to be complete or consistent. It needs a scaffold that lets competent parts find the path. This isn't belief, it's alignment with lab data. The Tian patch worked because it spoke voltage in a body. The Xenobots replicated by motion because a notch changed contact dynamics. The quantum effects mattered because proteins built pockets where weirdness helps, then handed outcomes to ions and flows. OSIM just names the pattern and turns it into a build sheet. So what's next? Simple, measurable moves. Write and read stable bioelectric maps in regeneration models and show anatomy-level edits that persist through turnover. Expand morphology libraries that predict competencies from shape, not gene lists, then validate in wet tissue. Design ultra-soft hybrids that exploit tunneling or coherence for room temperature sensing and beat rigid baselines under noise and stress. Run perturbation batteries that force adversarial conditions, heat, fouling, fatigue, and publish the head-to-heads. If OSIM's right, living hybrids will degrade gracefully, heal, and keep goals under load. The stakes, they're right here. Get the frame wrong, and you sink decades into brittle sims and overfit code. Get it right, and the doors open. Clinics that paint voltage instead of chasing symptoms. Materials that self-repair because morphology does the work. River sensors that adapt without firmware. Science stops pretending it can step faster than the wall and starts gardening around it. I'm telling you, the universe we can use isn't digital at the base. It's sovereign loops of shaped, fielded matter that learn to mean. We didn't just argue that. We touched it in a science paper from Chicago, a PNAS result with frog cells, and a stack of spectroscopy that made skeptics blink. Now we build. If life is the base layer, code is a costume, useful but never the skin. Subscribe if you want the next build turned into hardware, and share this with one person who still thinks reality runs on bits. Drop a comment with the lab test you run to break OSIM. We'll pick the strongest, do it with real researchers, and report back wins or fails. We cross the wall by growing across it, not by hacking.